And now heading over to Ilja to go more into detail with Work Package 3 about service integration.
Hello. So thank you very much for giving the opportunity to talk a bit more about what the EOSC-Nordic is planning to do in relationship to the services. And to summarize a bit the whole activities that are done in the EOSC-Nordics, this is the nice diagram that captures that. And it basically can be approached both from the point of view of stakeholders, so groups that we aim with each particular activity, but also the interactions that are between the different groups. So in this talk, I will primarily be talking about the service providers. This is not only infrastructure, it's basically whoever is doing services or considers themselves doing services in the future aimed at other people. Just out of curiosity, could you please raise the hands, those that consider themselves service providers now or in the near future? Okay, so actually a very limited number of people. So let's see if we can change this at the end of the talk. So when we're talking about the services, the whole goal of the EOSC-Nordic Work Package 3 is to have an alignment on service delivery. Both in terms of the integration, meaning that to integrate the services which are offered locally by national, regional, university level with the EOSC, but also to align more in terms of the concept of services, what it means, how to describe them, so that when the users are coming and using the services, it's not new project to learn about the service each time, but they are somewhat replaceable. And finally, we do aim to avoid extra effort for the service provider. So we want to automate as much as possible of all these actions to hopefully put, let's say, the C back to the EOSC. So I'll just briefly show this slide, and this is the concept of Work Package 3. And that is that the EOSC services are actually built from the regional and national services, meaning that we have pan-European services, but we also have a lot of them which are locally done. And the point of EOSC-Nordic is to address primarily those that are regional. So it's not the only focus, but let's say this is our primary focus. So what we want to do is to enable a somewhat typical generic process of research, which includes different steps, primarily revolving around the data. So it can be related to the data processing, archiving, analysis, and so on. And in the cycle, nowadays it's typical that a number of external services are used. In practice, these can be both national services, very local services like a laptop, or can be something delivered as a research infrastructure on a European level or worldwide level. So our goal is actually to address these lines, the dotted lines, and to make sure that they can be actually there. Because if you want to replace a service for data archiving, it doesn't mean that you need to restructure the whole research process. So we want to make it somewhat more compact and see how it works on the European level. So the first thing that we want to do, and that's what was happening in parallel, is to actually understand what is out there. Different countries have somewhat different levels of maturity with respect to that. So there are some countries that include national level registries of the services that could be offered. There are those that don't have that. So we do have different approaches to that. We first start by saying that we only go for the aggregators of services in each country, and we get the information from there. In the end, we establish a support pipeline for service providers that would like to play this game, so to say, so that they would be able to have a clear steps as to what that means. Basically, the EOSC service at the moment can be described as a service available through the EOSC portal. Now, what it exactly means in technical terms, in rules of participation terms, in the sustainability terms, and so on, this is something that the EOSC working groups are working on. And I think that all countries have representation there, as Lena showed. So at the moment, it's a bit in flux. So what we are aiming is to kind of target that moving target that would allow us to say that the services that we map and describe are eventually compliant. We also aim at the semantic alignment, and this basically means that we want to make sure that different organizations have used similar or preferably the same words when they describe how the services are done, who is responsible for them, what happens if, what they provide, and so on. So a bit of vocabulary alignment, a bit of actual alignment. So this is something that we do within Work Package 3, and for the next year, this is one of the, let's say, side activities to make sure that it's easier for the end user to consume such services. Finally, so the EOSC, the way how EOSC sees the services being interoperable across all the regions of Europe, not just the Nordics, is something that has been changing. So now there is more discussion about the federation of different services versus a single pot of services. Maybe it's something that will change over time. So we want to build something within EOSC-Nordic that for sure works in the Nordics and is compliant with the EOSC regulations. We also want to make sure that this could be showcased as a use case or success story, rather, for the EOSC model in general. This is not that we build first and so for 3 years and then show something, but this is an ongoing process where we provide feedback on the pros and cons of different approaches that we have. Now, if we go a bit more technical, there are a number of subtasks within this work package, and we have, let's say, a first group of tasks where we have an effort in each country in the Nordics dedicated to a certain activity. It can be mapping of the services, it can be supporting of the existing or mature services. The whole point there is to make sure that within each country there is a point where you can go and get information about EOSC, let's say, publishing, and that it will be close to you and, well, familiar to you. And we have a bit more dedicated tasks where we have a little more concentrated effort on a particular topic. So in particular, for example, the automation of service discovery, of publishing, and so on, where we have then some use cases or some ideas how that can be done better. If to put it together, essentially what we are aiming at, we want to have a semantic alignment, meaning that we agree what a service is, so that everybody is clear on that topic. Then we want to align on the maturity model. So once we know what we have in general, we need to agree on what is the ideal version of the service that can be shared. So we call it a maturity model, and this is essentially a checklist that also allows us to understand what is needed in order to get to a higher level. Just to give an example, for example, this can be for each service that we would know what types of organizations are able to consume that. Or it can be that each service has an attached privacy policy if it deals with the data. So all these minor aspects that are essentially packaged together in the maturity model is what we're doing. To avoid that this data is kind of ad hoc in each particular case, we also aim to use as many of registered data, or let's say persistent IDs, for some references, like it can be a global ID for an organization, it can be a global ID for the service. So, and whatever comes along with the PIDs is something that we're after. Finally, the processes are important as well, not just the processes of managing the services, but the processes of delivering, of supporting the service. So what it means if tomorrow, let's say, there is a service in Dyke and somebody from Finland would like to get it. What exactly would be the delivery process? Would it be different if tomorrow somebody from Denmark would go to CSC and request the service? If at least the steps or the concepts would be the same, that's already a huge win, because at the moment there is, at least there is a lack of understanding whether it's generally the same or not. So just to give an example, there was a Nike, well, there is a Nike project where also Nike is participating, Dillinger, where we did this alignment to try to share the HPC resources across several countries. And one of the steps was to understand for each particular service who can access that in general, for which we can say that if you are this category, then okay, we can continue working with you. So this is just a small screenshot of that. So we wanted to understand if the resources are shared, then if your organization, the client organization, is one of those types, whether it makes sense to show you the service at all or not. This mapping is an example of what we would like to have in order to make sure that it makes sense to talk about service discovery and service delivery. Another example from the same project, Dillinger, that we see as providing a lot of input into the EOSC-Nordic is actually about deciding across all the countries what is the minimal set of information that each service provider would like to get about the request for getting access to the service, so that the decision could be made whether the service could be granted or not. So this is to avoid the movement of emails, to avoid misclarities and so on. So we have come up with several fields that for the moment, only for HPC, seems to satisfy at least 4 or 5 countries. So that's already an achievement. So we want to do more in EOSC-Nordic and to go beyond just HPC, but for other services as well. It might be that the same information package would be good enough for everybody. Then we're especially happy. So when we're talking about the federation of services, then it's clear then if you have some service in Denmark working, users are happy, and then somebody comes and says, now you have to do it differently. Most probably there will be at least some resistance. Most probably it will be a lot of resistance. So it's clear that whenever the solutions are proposed which are intrusive, there is a high risk of them not being accepted. So the way we approach is, it's clear that there will be a federation of services, but it's also clear that within the Nordics there is a high level of trust between, well, at least among the countries, and there is a higher level of IT integration than in quite many other countries in Europe. So what we want to figure out is whether we can find a way which is both good for EOSC, but also, let's say, a way how is the most efficient for service federation applicable in the Nordics. So this is a kind of a protocol for collaboration that we are working on, and this previous example of figuring out the metadata that we need about each service is an example of that thing. So with that in place, we would be able to easily explain how you can make use of the service in the other country, or how can you make what you need to do in order to be available as a service for the other country. One important aspect is that we decided that we want to go for services that are available on the national level within EOSC-Nordic. If the service is only oriented for European ones, there is a separate track, and it's mostly covered by other European projects. If it's not, then we are also ready to do that. But within the EOSC-Nordic, the main goal is to go for the services that are currently or are planned to be offered on the national level. And we want to figure out what it takes to take them to the next level, at least to offer them across the borders. So EOSC is essentially can be described by a number of policies that are being developed and worked. Probably from the service perspective, the most important are rules of participation. So unfortunately, it's still in the works, so it's a bit complicated to say what exactly it entitles. For sure, it will mean that the services should be described in a certain way that is common across all countries. The work on that is currently being done in EOSC project, although with the previous contributions from the Infra Central and the new upcoming project, EOSC Enhance, which should take over that. It's clear that at least several sections should be described for each service available in the EOSC. So about who is providing that, so the service provider information, what the service is all about, how to manage it, I mean, how it's managed, what are the policies behind, what are the terms of services, what are the privacy policies, and how to actually get it. So at least these 4 basic steps will need to be described. So current state is that there is a quite complicated set of Google Sheets that needs to be filled for each of these sections that contains a number of fields. Clearly, this is not something that motivates you to do, so we're we are looking at ways how to do that in a more automated fashion. The example here has actually been auto-generated already, so the early work is already producing some results. So to summarize, in Work Package 3, our approach will be such that we will look for the services that are available locally and suggest that they first need to become available regionally or nationally. So by that, you solve a lot of problems already within the country. Once this is there, and you want to offer them on the European level, there would be a next step to go for the EOSC. EOSC-Nordic fits both here and here. So here we have support for the onboarding of EOSC services. Here we have support for linking the discovered services with EOSC. So we see that within each region, or let's say within each country, there would be a bit more like an aggregator of services. It already is in the factor in quite many countries, apart from maybe some minor ones. So this is the approach that we have. Thank you very much for the attention. Len already showed that we have a website. Unfortunately, when I was making the slides, it was not yet up. So there is a link just to clarify. We will be rolling out a bit more concrete instructions as to what needs to be done if you want to publish the services and if you want to access them as the time goes by. And here I stop. And
thank you very much, Ilja. And now I think everyone will be able to remember the website, seeing it now twice. So this is time for questions, both for Ilja about the service onboarding and for Lene more generally about the EOSC-Nordic project. Please, who likes to ask or comment? So you're welcome to offer comments as well.
Thanks. My name's Thomas. Thanks for the nice talk. You talked about the you have a maturity model. How are you sort of using that? Is that in sort of aspects to the fair or to open or to confidentiality or technically, or what is it you mean by that?
Yeah. So this will be a kind of a, let's say, living model. We start with a description of the service, and we make sure that the service, the mandatory fields of a service are described. So the first step is to figure out if in general we have enough information, the very mandatory information about the service. We plan to integrate the FAIR certification into this model. Actually, this is activity which is done by WP3 within the EOSC-Nordic. And I think it should be done roughly in half a year or so, at least the first versions of how to approach that. So once the principles are in place, this is something we plan to integrate into the maturity model. And I mean, the model is maybe a complicated word, but the whole point is to have a kind of a way to understand whether the service is good enough, and if not, what needs to be done in order to get to the ideal version as is defined by several attributes. It's not, it could be fair, it could be other things. Actually, it's for sure is other things, so at least 4 categories of different aspects. It's also about, for example, the sustainability. It's also about the fair and so on. So there are a number of attributes there that we have considered to include. In the very first step, to avoid making too complicated model, we go for description only.
Other questions?
I have a comment only just for as a service. The Danish colleagues we have in Work Package 3 is is Martin Beck from Dijk and Claudio Pica from SDU that will be supporting at national level as well how to open up services. Yeah.
Okay. Then I have a question for you, Ilja, which is maybe a little bit overall question about this onboarding. You're saying you're focusing on Nordic, already existing Nordic and national. What will be the motivation? Because many of us have missions to serve a certain community. We have funding to serve a certain, for instance, national community. So what would be the selling point for a national service to move into this EOSC space and offer your service for users in other countries?
That's, I think, is actually a core question about EOSC in general. So this is the question that I think for moving from national to EOSC is a similar question in a sense as to why should you offer local service on the national level. So there is a funding schema which is intended to motivate services to be offered. So that's the work of the sustainability group. At the moment, to my knowledge, there are no, let's say, final decisions. There are ideas what could be done. So it would be incorrect if I would say my preference, probably. But hopefully the motivation would be clear, whether it's a co-funding mechanism, whether it's quota-based and access to other services. For the service provider, offering services beyond its scope is clearly a tackle. You get more user support, you get more operational costs. So unless it's somehow compensated in a reasonable way, it's somewhat doomed project. So I think this is understood by all people who are participating, that this is one of the core questions. Today, I cannot give you an answer because this is essentially work in progress. So probably this is the answer to question to European Commission.
But it's probably something you will have to pretty soon work on, yes, to get anybody on board
yes,
in
exactly,
your project.
And that's actually one of the reasons why we are preparing now and not yet published the steps for getting the services on, because we want to have a clear explanation as to why you might want to be on. So this motivational aspect is important. In some cases, the projects get in the EOSC portal because this is what they have written in the description of work. But this is a very derivative motivation. So we want to find a natural motivation for offering and sharing services across the countries. As I said before, what is the motivation for local service provider to go to the national level? I don't know, maybe somebody has an answer.
Anybody wants to comment on that? In general, the motivation? Yes?
You gain some weight on a national plan, so you could apply for different funding. So
this is one thing. Increasing the sustainability of the service by exposing it more. There is in the architecture working group, there is an idea that if we are talking about a somewhat automated processing, in which case you can span different countries, then the way you attribute both the data, the services, software, and is by using the PIDs to reference them. So this would allow you to kind of automatically derive attribution of the final results, let's say scientific output, to the components that were used for delivering that. So this is a bit of a vision. It does work in some communities, but not across whole EOSC for sure. So if that is in place, it's great. However, currently there is no funding that would directly promote this kind of usage. There is indirect, clearly, that when you, let's say, apply or in general serve more users, then the more communities you have under your control, the more is the, let's say, sustainability of the service. If that is a good enough motivation, sure.
Any last question? And Sophie?
Yes, so the policy approach, when you are saying that you have to, is also, let's say, maybe not the best approach, but it works. So whenever you have a connection to funding and that you have to satisfy that, if it's natural and doesn't give many costs, typically people are not saying that, no, I don't want to go for open science. So within EOSC, I think, but when we're talking about service providers, there must be a bit more motivation because operating, especially the larger services, is quite expensive. So there must be a bit more balanced model.
Okay, we're coming to an end. I'll allow myself the last comment and tapping into one of the things you mentioned, Ilja, about trust, because this is when you hear discussion in the global community about building what's sometimes referred to as the Internet of Fair Data and Services. Trust is very brought to the top almost of the list as a very, very crucial concept. So maybe from what you said, that's one of the things where we can actually contribute something from the Nordic countries and something EOSC-Nordic could really bring out to the world. So thank you very much to our speakers. Should we give a hand to Lena and Ilja?